right, welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. I'm so glad you came along. Come inside. Come inside. We're going to talk today about tissues. So we've been working our way up levels of complexity, right? We started with biomolecules, which is sort of the most basic type of function. Then we put those together to make our organelles within our cells. That's the basic unit of life, right? Now we're putting those together into tissues and then move very quickly into our first organ system, which is the skin. That's the second video that you're going to watch after this. In this particular video, we're going to look at the overview of what tissues are. We're going to look at a few tissues. We're not going to cover all of the different types. We will hit those throughout the semester when we do muscular, nervous, endocrine, and skeletal systems. We'll cover all the main tissue types. And then next semester, we'll get into the organ systems that have a mixture of these different tissue types. So getting us into that, then we've got our body tissues. And so body tissues are groups of cells with similar function and similar structure. So if you have one type of cell all together, that's a tissue. We've got four primary types of tissues, and we're going to spend the first semester looking at organ systems that are primarily these tissue types. We've got epithelial tissue, or the epithelium, so we're going to get into skin a lot on that one, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Locations, we're going to start immediately with epithelial tissues. That's the first one. We can find those on body coverings, like skin, for example. Linings of cavities and organs. Something like the stomach, for example, has epithelial tissue in it. It's not just epithelial tissue. As well as glandular tissue. So your glands, think endocrine glands, like your adrenal glands, are primarily epithelial tissue. Primary functions of epithelial tissues are protection, absorption, filtration, and secretion. So some basic characteristics. You can classify epithelium in a number of different ways. One of the ways that you can do that is by how many layers that you have. And so these different cells will fit together and often form sheets. And you can see in the diagram here. And so another characteristic of epithelium is it's got different surfaces. So there is an apical surface, that's the top surface. It's free of any tissue. Typically, you've got empty space basically on the other side of the apical surface. The opposite side of that is the lower surface, or the basal surface, and that's going to rest on some sort of basement membrane. Now, a lot of times this tissue is connective tissue that it's attached to, and so this is how we get the linings, especially of like internal organs and things like that. They are avascular, which means they have no blood supply. So basically, they have to rely on simple diffusion through the cells in order for the cells to survive. And they do this basically, they're all, since if you notice, they're all very tightly bound together right here. And so basically you've got like ports that nutrients can make their way through the cells, through these little holes in the cell membranes as they're bound together. These cells typically will regenerate very easily if they are well nourished. So they work very well for tissues that get a lot of abuse, basically like your skin, for example, regenerates very quickly as long as it has a pretty constant food supply. So we can classify epithelia in a number of different ways. The number of ways we can do that, or one of the ways we can do that, is the number of cells. If it's one cell, then we call it simple. If it's more than one cell, so two or more layers, we call it stratified. So simple is one layer, one sheet. Stratified is more than one sheet stacked on top of each other. The other way that we can classify epithelia is the shape of the cells. So if they are flat, they're known as squamous, kind of look like fish scales. If they are more evenly shaped all the way around, we call them cuboidal, which is cube-shaped, kind of like dice. Now, so they're more regularly shaped. The dimensions, length, width, and height are going to be more or less the same. And then the third one is columnar. So think of a column, right? Very tall, very skinny. And so our cells, columnar cells, are going to be tall and skinny, kind of like columns. Okay, so we're going to be coming back now to that concept that we discussed at the beginning of the school year about how the structure of different parts of the body determine the function. So we're going to look at that structure, either the number of cells, simple versus stratified, or the shape, squamous, cuboidal, and columnar, determine the function, what those particular tissues do. So if we have simple squamous epithelial tissue, that means one layer of very thin scale-like cells. You're typically going to find those in places where diffusion and filtration have to take place, your kidneys, your small intestine, or secretion in serous membranes. Now, serous membranes are membranes that are secrete some sort of fluid. So think linings of body cavities and things like that. The serum is derived. Serous is derived from serum. Acts as a shock absorber and a lubricant for the organs. We have squamous, stratified squamous, many layers of scales. It's protection, like an armor. With simple cuboidal or columnar, those are very similar. You'll find those in places where secretion or absorption need to take place, so like glandular tissue or in small intestines during digestion. They also will propel mucus or reproductive cells, so moving those through different tracts and things like that. They're similar. They have similar functions, and we're going to talk about those in a little bit greater detail here in just a second. If we have stratified cuboidal or columnar, those are also for protection. However, you don't really find these. You don't find stratified cuboidal or columnar in humans. Now, there's another one that we'll talk about briefly here called transitional, and those are their shape changes based on the need. They're primarily for protection, but they also allow stretching, and so we'll find those in our urinary bladder. And in females, to a certain extent, you'll find them in the uterus, but we'll get to that stuff a little bit later. But anything that needs to allow for stretching, you'll find transitional cells, and they're going to be stratified. We'll look at why here in just a moment. So first, let's talk about simple epithelial cells. Simple epithelial cells, you can see here in the diagram, each one of the little dark spots is a nucleus. And so if you want to be able to track what the different layers are, you look at the nuclei. And if you have nuclei stacked on top of each other, then they're stratified. So this is simple. This is the lining of the lungs, where gas exchange actually takes place. You don't want the oxygen coming in and the carbon dioxide coming out to have to pass through a lot of cells. That slows down the process. And so you've only got one set of cells. You can also find these in the walls of capillaries, around serous membranes. They function in, like I said, diffusion, filtration, and secretion. Then we have simple cuboidal, which is a simple layer of cube-like cells. And so if you look especially here in the circles, you can see those single layers of cells right in here going around. These are common in glands and the ducts that help move the hormones along. They're found in the walls of kidney tubules for filtration, and they cover the surfaces of ovaries, which is important if we were trying to release follicles, which ultimately become eggs. They can also, if they have cilia, they can propel mucus. So we'll find cells that are kind of like these in the respiratory system when we talk about that and mucus movement and stuff like that, as well as reproductive cells like the ovaries. Simple columnar cells kind of look like this, and you can see basically they look like rows of houses, long houses, right? And remember, each little purple circle is a nucleus. So it's a single layer of tall cells. Typically, most commonly, we'll see these in the form of goblet cells. So if you look right here, this little cloud-looking thing right there, that's mucus that's about to be pushed into this channel right here. Okay, you'll find goblet cells anywhere mucus has to be secreted, so the lining of the digestive tract to help move things along. And also your mucous membranes, so these are tissues that line openings, so ears, eyes, nose, mouth, anus, urogenital openings, stuff like that, are mucous membranes, because stuff has to come in, but we want to try to keep the bad stuff out, and so mucus does that. And then ciliated types. So cilia is basically like tiny little hairs, and so they wave around kind of like this, but they can push things along. And they'll push mucus from those goblet cells along so they can move stuff down through these channels. Pseudo-stratified. So pseudo-stratified is a little bit different. Pseudo, if you see the word pseudo, that means fake or false. So pseudo-stratified columnar cells, and this is the only time that we would ever see them, is pseudo-stratified columnar. So they're tall cells. If you look at the diagram here, they're very tall cells, but also if you notice, like right here, they don't make columns all the way from top to bottom. Okay, they make it most of the way up or most of the way down, but not all the way through. But they're not really classified as the other two types because their shapes are all wrong. And so this is the type that will have, there's a single layer typically, but sometimes they'll have multiple layers, but it's not consistent all the way across. So you get it looks like it's stratified, but it's not actually stratified. These you'll find in your respiratory tract, moving phlegm up and down, and moving particulates that are caught in the phlegm that are trapped, and then they're moved up, and basically they make it to where your windpipe meets your esophagus, and then you swallow that stuff and it gets destroyed by the stomach acid. Now we get into the stratified stuff. So we've got multiple layers on these. Stratified squamous are stacks, are layers of sheets of flattened cells. They're typically found where friction is common, so they serve a protective role. The outer portion of the skin, your mouth and your esophagus are going to be stratified epithelial cells. Stratified cuboidal cells are typically two layers of cuboidal cells that's function and protection. Same thing with columnar cells. The surface cells are columnars, and then the other layers underneath are different sizes and shape. That's also protection. But like I said earlier, those are very rare in the human body, and those are found in the ducts of very large glandular tissue. Transitional, like we had talked about, so we had mentioned that allows stretching to occur, and so they're modified, stratified, squamous epithelial cells, and they're able to stretch out, but then the key part is they can return back to their original shape. So if you look at the diagram right here, your bladder is transitional epithelial cells. It's pretty much the only place you're going to have those that require the level of stretching, but then returning back to their original shape. You've got some spaces in your body that do stretch, but they don't have this particular type of tissue, and they have different mechanisms for allowing the organ or the space to expand. Within epithelial tissue, you also have glandular epithelial tissue, which forms your glands. And a gland is any one or more cells that secrete a product. Okay, think of a chemical or a fluid or something like that. The secretions contain proteins in an aqueous fluid. So when we say aqueous, that means they're dissolved in water. Okay. Secretion is an active process, so we're going to be talking about active transport. It takes energy to secrete things. Glandular epithelium, there's two types of glands. We've got endocrine glands. Endo is with inside. These are ductless glands. That means we don't have little channels and stuff that stuff passes through. The secretions, typically hormones, are going to dissolve directly into the bloodstream. Everything here are hormones. So like thyroids, the pituitary, the adrenals. The pancreas has an endocrine function that by secreting stuff directly into the bloodstream. The other one is exocrine. These have ducts that empty onto the some sort of epithelial surface. These will empty into ducts, so your liver, which sends things like bile down ducts where it's collected. The other functions that the pancreas have are exocrine. Your sweat and your oil glands are also exocrine glands because they dump into ducts. And you have internal and external. So like sweat and oil are external because they dump to the outside. Liver and pancreas are examples of internal because they keep everything inside the body. So that's pretty much epithelial tissue. There's a lot going on. I think as far as vocab-wise, that one's probably the heaviest. The one that is the most diverse as far as just going all over the place is connective tissue. Now, connective tissue is found everywhere in the body. It is the most abundant and the most widely distributed tissues throughout the body. And the functions are protection, holding things together, that's why it's called connective tissue, and supporting the body. Your bones, for example, are connective tissue, so are tendons, ligaments, and stuff like that. One of the major layers of the skin that we'll talk about in the next video is connective tissue. So characteristics of connective tissue, two main things. One is variations in blood supply. So some blood tissues are very well vascularized. That means there are blood vessels running to them, so they have adequate blood flow. Some of them are poorly vascularized or avascular, which means they don't have any blood flow going to them whatsoever. Your bones, for example, would fall into this category. They don't have a lot of blood going to them, and we'll look at that in a little bit greater detail when we get into the skeletal system in about a month or so. The biggest thing about connective tissue, that how we can bind together all these disparate types of tissues, is something called an extracellular matrix. Connective tissue is the only one that has an extracellular matrix, okay? An extracellular matrix is the non-living material that surrounds living cells. So all the other tissues, they're all cells bunched together. So we've got cells directly adjacent to cells. With connective tissue, we have cells suspended in something, and that something is the extracellular matrix. So the extracellular matrix has two parts. The first part is the ground substance. That is the mostly water with some sort of adhesion proteins to hold things together, and polysaccharides, and fibers. The fibers are produced by cells that are kind of act like a network of girders to hold things together. And the fibers primarily in the extracellular matrix is what's going to determine the characteristics of the connective tissue. Now there's three types of fibers. Okay, the first one is collagen or white fibers. It's a very tough, very strong fiber. We have elastic fibers, which allow a lot of flexibility and stretchability and movement and stuff like that. And then we have reticular fibers, which are a type of collagen fiber. Similar function to collagen fibers, slightly different structure. So 5 types of connective tissue, going from most rigid, hardest, whatever, to softest or most fluid. To me personally, thinking about it as most fluid is better. So going from most rigid, least amount of movement, to most fluid, most amount of movement, okay? We have bone, cartilage, dense connective tissue, loose connective tissue, and then, this kind of blows people's minds a little bit, blood. And when we get into the circulatory system, we're going to really dig deep into what makes that. Blood has those characteristics. It has cells surrounded by an extracellular matrix of fibers, water, and other fluid. Okay, so think about it for a second. You'll kind of see what, if you know anything about the constituents of blood, how it fits into that. We're going to be focusing on two types of connective tissue, dense and loose connective tissue. Bone and cartilage we'll talk about in the skeletal system, and then blood we'll talk about in the circulatory system in January. So dense connective tissue, also known as dense fibrous tissue, is mostly collagen fiber in the matrix. So it's very, very hard. It's very tough, very strong. Not as strong, not as tough as bone, but it doesn't need to be that strong. Okay, we've got fibroblasts, are a specific type of cell that makes the fibers that everything's embedded in. Your dense connective tissue is going to be found in your tendons. Tendons attach muscle to bone. Your ligaments hold bones together to create joints. Those are more elastic than ligaments. You can also, it's easier to tear ligaments than it is tendons also. And then the dermis, which we're going to get into in the next video, and that's why we're including dense connective tissue in this, which is part of your skin. It's the lowest level of your skin. Okay, so we're also going to talk about loose connective tissue. Now, there's two types of loose connective tissue. Now, loose connective tissue is kind of like dense connective tissue, but not as many collagen fibers. There's also more elastic fibers, so this allows for more movement and more flexibility. So the first loose connective tissue type that we're going to talk about is areolar connective tissue. Now, this is the most widely distributed connective tissue, and it basically forms like almost like cobwebs that are wrapping around everything. And so we're going to find this almost like, these are the areolar connective tissue is going to be the tissue that holds all of your organs together and anchors them to the body cavity or wall or whatever cavity wall that they're in. You can have layers of this stuff called lamina propria that basically act as a basement membrane that other membranes attach to, specifically epithelial tissue attached to. All the different fiber types within here create a very loose network. These are also very absorptive, so they can absorb excess fluid. However, this causes a condition known as edema, which is excess fluid buildup in the spaces around the organs. Pulmonary edema, for example, is a buildup of fluid around the lungs and the heart. And that becomes a problem because that fluid puts pressure on those organs, so they're not able to move and flex like they're supposed to. The other type of loose connective tissue that we're going to look at is adipose tissue. Now, adipose tissue is also a part of your skin. Adipose tissue is your, these are your layers of fat. So when you hear people complaining about how they need to lose fat, they're losing it here. And so those lipid molecules that we talk about get collected in adipose cells. And so if you look at these cells right here, there's a giant fat vacuole that has this lipid droplet in there. And then you can see right here the teeny tiny little nuclei. So as far as adipose cells are concerned, they're basically, I mean, they're fat storage. They have all the other organelles that we talked about earlier in the school year, but they're very much predominated by this vacuole, kind of like plant cells. And so if you look at the photomicrograph, a photomicrograph is a picture underneath a microscope, okay? So it's just a fancy term for that. And so you can see the fat cells here. Here's that fat vacuole with the nucleus in the darker purple right there. Typically you'll find these, they protect organs. They act like shock absorbers. They also act like insulators. And it's where that long-term fuel storage for those lipids is found. So basically soft, padded parts of your body are going to have these. So now what you need to do, you've gotten an overview of tissues, specifically the tissues related to the first organ system that you're going to study, which is the integumentary system, which is basically your skin. So go ahead and go on over to video number 2 so you can look about the skin. We'll re-hit some of the stuff that we just talked about, dig into a little bit more about what skin is, the different parts of it, what its functions are, and stuff like that. If you have any questions as you're going through, jot those down, let me know, send me a message, send me an email, see me in class. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing y'all again soon.